Hello and welcome to Nature Connections. I'm Camille, an artist and the founder of Project Roots, which is an art and lifestyle brand. Thanks to everyone who's watching or listening to this video. With Nature Connections, we give you refreshing and inspiring thoughts and tips to bring nature into your life and into your home. So we hear the stories of people from all paths of life, but who have one thing in common, which is that they help us to connect with nature around us and live a more rooted life. In today's episodes, I'll be speaking with a very special guest, David Elliott. So hi, David, and thank you so much for joining me. David is the CEO of Trees for Cities, which is a UK charity working at national and international scale, I believe, to improve the lives of local communities by planting trees, specifically in cities. David has a wide-ranging international professional career across, I think, third sector organizations. So really, it seems like on a mission to make a difference in the world and for society, which is fantastic. So today, I'm really interested in discovering your views on sort of the importance of this connection to nature in our lives, and learning about tree planting, really, which I hope you can help us with, considering your background. Yeah, there's so many different tree planting initiatives and models worldwide that it's really hard to make sense of what these are for and what the benefits are really of planting trees. So I'm hoping you could help me demystify that and understand the benefits of tree planting for the environment, for us, and for our communities. But yeah, let's first start with you. I'd love to get to know you better, really. And can you tell us more about your background? What is your personal connection to trees and nature, and sort of how have you journeyed to Trees for Cities?
Sure. Well, great. Thanks very much. Lovely to meet you, Camille, and it's great to be on your podcast for the day. So, yeah, my journey, as you mentioned, it's been a slightly well, perhaps non-linear journey, perhaps, to get to working at Trees for Cities. Most of my career I've spent actually in the non-profit sector, working for different non-profits and charities, and a lot of that was doing overseas international work, and moved between different sectors, more human-related, animal-related, and environment-related, actually. So sort of cut across some different management roles for different charities, but always really had a strong interest and passion for the environment, particularly, and always really wanted to make a move at some point in my career into an environmental organisation. I was fortunate to earlier in my career, I was involved with trees, specifically as a trustee for the International Tree Foundation. So from more of the international perspective, sort of seeing what's going on a tree planting perspective, on that global front. And around just over 6 years ago, this fantastic opportunity came up with Trees for Cities to run the charity, to take it over. A charity that had been in operation for over 20 years, so really well established in London. We were originally Trees for London, and then transitioned to Trees for Cities after a few years, as our work actually spread from London to other towns and cities across the UK and internationally, as you mentioned. So yeah, that role came up, as I say, around 6 years ago, and since then it's been for me a really fascinating journey. Actually, there's been enormous amounts of activity and change, and I think growth and interest really in what we do, both from a tree perspective. So trees have really sort of risen up the agenda, the political agenda, business agenda, the social agenda. In areas like obviously climate has really linked trees to our everyday lives, but a whole range of other issues like air quality, access to nature, the quality of green spaces and how important they are to us in our everyday lives. So I think that tree aspect has definitely grown alongside the urban environmentalism. So I think once upon a time, people probably thought about the environment as something that happened in the countryside. That's where nature and that's where the wild places existed. But I think there's a real reality now, a real waking up that most of us in this country, over 80% of us, live in towns and cities now. So our natural spaces, our green spaces, are absolutely critical to our well-being, and for biodiversity as well. Actually, nature does have havens in towns and cities. And so I think that urban environmentalism has really risen up the agenda. So it's been a fascinating time to be involved for the last few years, to see the growth in the interest, and to help develop the charity, alongside that general growth in the sector that we're seeing.
Fantastic. And you said something really specifically on nature and well-being, as a concept, and that's something I'm really interested in. And I was wondering, before we come back to more about tree planting specifically and the benefits of that, what is your personal sort of relationship to nature in terms of how this impacts your well-being? Is this something that you also feel and sort of have felt throughout your life?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I've always been somebody who loves being in nature, like many of us, and probably most of us who are watching this today. I mean, I've had through my life many interests that involve being in the outdoors, whether it's mountaineering or scuba diving, or spending time in the great outdoors. For me, is my great passion. And I think again, for me, that was always something that I did really historically in a more rural, wild context. And now that I'm very much living in a city, I appreciate the need to transfer that to your more local urban environment. And actually, it's very possible. There are so many fantastic pieces of nature and wild spaces within our towns and cities that for discovery. And I'm always still discovering new places, really exciting places. They don't have to be huge. They don't have to be great expanses of wilderness. Sometimes a small space, a small, high quality, interesting or biodiverse green space can be just as beneficial to us as some of the great wildernesses outside of our towns and cities. So yeah, for me, it's really important to go to those places and to connect and to give me, like many people, an opportunity to escape all what's going on around you in the city, which is a wonderful place, but is also fairly all-consuming in terms of your senses, for example. So to get away and just to escape the sound, the people, the activity is I think absolutely vital. I think we really realised that when through the pandemic, for example, obviously less so around escaping the noise at the time, but having a place to go to that's outside of our homes and our immediate spaces to escape and to put our minds into a different place. And I think that's both the physical and the mental well-being aspects. Obviously, the physical aspect in terms of exercise and recreational activities, but the psychological aspects of being in a green space and getting away from it all and having an alternative in your life, I think has proven to be absolutely essential in our everyday lives.
Yeah, it's great to hear that you also share that as well. And obviously from a more wilderness perspective, it's true that, it's important to have it around us, but also having those more wild escapes is something really valuable. But you also mentioned that it's risen to the agenda also. Like it's very much top of mind around us. Like everyone I know is suddenly a lot more aware of this importance of nature in our life and sort of connecting to it, or just being a bit more sensitive to it. Do you think, you mentioned the pandemic, do you think that's the main reason why suddenly like we're more aware of this, or do you think there are other reasons why this is suddenly top of mind and top of the agenda? I know there's also the Jubilee, like tree planting in the UK that's happening this year, and suddenly it does seem to be the year of trees or the years of trees. Why do you think that is?
I think the pandemic very much helped to sort of cement that in our realization that's going on. But I mean, this has been, I think, a transition that's been happening for a number of years now and predated the pandemic in that sense. The pandemic really brought it to life, I think, in that sense, in terms of how vital it is to have those escapes, those places in our towns and cities. But as mentioned, I think we've been seeing that growth in realization now for a long time. I think to some degree it's underpinned by more science, actually. I think we probably always knew that in the back of our minds, but what we're doing now is really understanding and researching and measuring the impact that nature is having to us, to our lives from an urban context. And that's, I think there are now many more studies, systems to actually put meat on the bone in terms of understanding what that really means to us, and using hard and fast data to understand the differences in people's lives between people who have good access to nature, and those who don't. And there are, sadly, there are some very strong correlations between people who don't have good high quality green spaces nearby compared to those who do, in terms of indicators around well-being, health, and correlates closely to other sort of demographic indicators as well. So actually, there is hard and fast data showing that benefit from a purely scientific basis, alongside obviously the more qualitative approach that we take, just knowing how much better you feel when you've had a chance to get outside and do something natural, even if it is within the confines of your city. So I think that really has I suppose come through as a field of science and study now, which is proving every day we're getting more and more data and research coming out showing those benefits.
Yeah. That's a great point. Absolutely. And it's definitely more all over the news as well in terms of communicating these scientific research around trees, and yeah, it definitely has a snowball effect as well. The more we read about it, the more we understand the benefits of it. But so
and I think also probably on that there's I suppose going into a deeper sort of cultural perspective, but perhaps to some degree there's a bit of a backlash against other activities that perhaps fill people's lives. People wanting to find new or perhaps not new, but reconnect with things that they used to do, their children used to do, or grandchildren used to do, and to get back to a way of life which is perhaps rapidly changed over a generation. And we've seen a lot less, there are again statistics showing how much less time children these days spend outside than there was a generation or two ago. And I think that's come so quick, that change has happened really quickly. Now I think we're starting to realize that we need to reverse that change, and perhaps alongside what has been an enormous growth in commercialization and sort of perhaps a sort of shopping culture, actually is that giving people the level of satisfaction that they want in their lives. And yeah, probably just everyone likes nice things, of course, but actually that's not just the only answer to having a high quality life. There's lots of things we need to do, and I think there has been perhaps this rapid shift, and now we're just starting to come back again and realize that some of those lost aspects of our lives need to be replaced again.
Definitely, trees and nature make us happy, and we need that in our lives, as it's proven. But so why do we need to plant trees? Like, why can't we just, I'm just being a bit pushy here, but like, why can't we just appreciate the trees that we have around us? Why is it that we have to plant trees, and sort of what are the benefits of adding trees and making sure that that's done in the right way?
Yeah, well, again, from a city context, there is quite a difference often between the how we talk about trees in towns and cities as opposed to in the countryside. You could argue that if we were to let nature take its course in the countryside, we wouldn't have to plant many trees, because naturally nature would regrow, regenerate, or rewild, whatever phrase we're using for that. Obviously, it's not quite as simple as that, because tree planting is still required where that regrowth isn't happening for different reasons. But in an urban context, there's going to be very few spaces in reality where that rewild is going to take form, because of the way that we use our land. So we need to really be planting trees if we're going to have trees in our towns and cities. That's the reality. And alongside that, we also need to remember that trees do die. They are living beings which will come to the end of their natural life, or they'll often get pests and diseases through their life, which will mean that they have to be taken down. So there is of course a percentage of trees across all parts of towns and cities that every year will need to be removed, and that's not necessarily a bad thing as long as it's done in the right way. That has to happen. Old trees and dying trees need to be removed. So we need to be replacing those trees, obviously, and we need to ideally be at least replacing the number of trees that we're taking out to maintain a stable percentage or canopy cover of trees. But ideally, we want to be planting more than that. So actually, on a year-by-year basis, we're increasing the number of trees in our cities, on our streets, in our parks, in our woodlands, etc., around our towns and cities. So that needs to be, for us, the concept is we're trying to grow canopy cover. We talk a lot about in the sector about canopy cover, and that means a sort of percentage of, if you look down on top of a town or city from a sort of satellite, and you see how much percentage of the space is covered by tree canopy, we want to grow that percentage. And for many towns and cities, for London, for example, it's around 20%-ish, a bit less probably at the moment. It's different measurements provide slightly different results. And that's not bad for a town and city. London's quite a green place. Many towns and cities have canopy covers that are in single-digit percentage. They might have sort of 6 or 7% canopy cover. That's very, very little green space for an urban context. So that's one of the metrics we use to try and increase tree cover. Okay. Because again, then we come into all of the benefits that trees have to us in our towns and cities, and again, proven benefits. And the more tree canopy cover we have, the more we benefit from those, all of those things that trees can offer us. So, we want to not just because it's a nice thing to do or it looks nice. Of course, trees, in my view, do look great. I don't think humans have yet created an art form that can parallel nature. So just from an aesthetic perspective, it makes our lives better through the aesthetic benefits of that. But we know now all of the other benefits that trees bring as an essential part of the infrastructure of our towns and cities. So we want to increase that. We want to make our places better, and one of the ways to do that is to be bringing more trees in. So our ultimate aim is to increase that canopy cover everywhere we live.
Fantastic. And so how do you choose where to plant these trees and sort of what species you bring in? I suppose to be successful tree planting and for this canopy cover to grow and to be, prosper, you have to do a very good job at identifying where they'll be happiest and which trees will survive. What is the science behind this? At Trees for Cities specifically, how do you look at that?
Yeah, well, I mean, specifically as an organisation, so one of our concepts, we try to plant our trees where they're most needed. And very simplistically, I suppose our hotspots of activity are where we have lower canopy cover, so fewer trees, combined with spaces that generally have more social needs. So in terms of the indexes of social deprivation, they're more those spaces more in need. And as mentioned earlier, the two often overlap. The greyer, less green spaces tend to be those places in towns and cities where you have poorer social outcomes and economic outcomes. So for us, they're the areas that we want to be focusing our work and effort wherever possible, because then we can have, in a sense, sort of the biggest bang for the buck. So that's, and I mentioned London. London is when you look at the whole of London, it's actually quite a green city. And often people say, oh, London's got enough trees. Why do you need to plant any more trees? Well, in some senses, yes, there are parts of London that are very, very green, and probably greener than most cities in Europe. But actually, there are also parts of London that are in desperate need of more green space and more trees. So they're the places that we want to focus our efforts as much as we can. And then in terms of the actual trees themselves, you're absolutely right. It's a real science. It's a real skill. Tree, but people again sort of think, it must be easy enough just to go to a shop, buy a tree, put it in the ground. It's actually, there's a lot to it, and to get it right and to do it in the right way takes.
When you do a bit of gardening, you know that it's not that easy.
Well, that's true. But then if you think you need to put trees perhaps in a hard space that's on a street where you've got all of these underground services underneath, cables and pipe work, etc. You need to make a tree that's going to, you put a tree there that's going to survive and thrive. And it's going to be suitable for the conditions. It's not going to grow too big or too small. It's going to survive the air quality in that particular part of the city. It's going to have enough water coming to it to help it survive. So how you design the pit and the watering structure, for example, around the pit, all of these things need to be taken into consideration when you're understanding where to site a tree originally, what tree species you're going to put into the ground, and then making sure that it's planted correctly and it's looked after correctly. So there's a lot that has to go into it to make it actually work. It's not, obviously the conditions in the city are far more difficult for trees than they often are when they're naturally growing in the countryside, for example. So there's a lot that goes into that. It's not a simplistic task. And then in terms of the tree itself, so it's interesting in towns and cities because we personally, different organisations take different approaches, but our approach is that we plant both native and non-native species in cities. And the reason really for that is that, again, because of the unique conditions of cities, often the most suitable trees for a particular space will not actually be a native tree. It will be a tree from another country that's adapted and well adapted to the conditions that we're trying to put it into. So we have quite a broad range of species that we'll select from. We'll work with the local authorities. We mostly plant on local authority land, so we work close with the local authorities to understand what trees and what canopy they want to create. So we're coordinating efforts. But what that means is we end up creating in our towns and cities a real interesting mosaic of species. And I know you had Paul Wood on previously on one of these sessions, and Paul is one of the great experts in tree species in towns and cities, and written many books, and I'm sure he told you, how much of in a sense, a museum or an arboretum a city like London is. You can explore your local streets and discover things you wouldn't realise. Species from afar, exotic species, and it makes a really interesting, set of species that we have across our cities. Actually, and it's one of the things that people probably don't realise so much is on our doorstep. We have this fascinating sort of opportunity to explore and discover, which Paul is really bringing to life with his books. So it's it's an interesting mix that you end up in terms of tree species in towns and cities, and much more different to what you tend to see again in the countryside, which for valid reasons. Woodlands, our native woodlands are made up of our native species, and quite rightly, because they have more biodiversity value. The invertebrates have developed over millions of years to coexist with those species. It's a different set of challenges and conditions that we face in the city. So hence we end up with a different sort of portfolio of species.
Absolutely, and it's true. London is just a fantastic, museum of trees, and I love that about it. But it's true that there are a lot of, if we like more broadly, like a lot of tree planting initiatives where, you're buying a pair of shoes and they're planting a tree, or you're buying a t-shirt and they're planting a tree, and you have no idea where that tree is going to be, what it's, is actually going to survive, is actually planted responsibly, and is it the right tree to plant in the right place. Mm-hmm. But it also seems like, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, that there's little error that can be done in terms of planting trees. Is that true? Like sort of, that's pretty much not any tree, but like native species, wherever they're planted, they'll grow and they'll thrive. Is that the case?
To some degree, yeah. I think with I suppose that there's from an urban context, again, the conditions are so unique. So conditions such as rainfall and the heat, the urban heat island effect in cities, which often mean that our towns and cities are quite a few degrees hotter than, say, the local rural context. And so therefore the species that you might be planting in the countryside that have grown and developed and evolved, adapted over the years for certain conditions, just simply won't do very well in the cities because of the temperature, the water, the air quality, etc. The other big issue that we're facing in the UK at the moment is pest and diseases. So many of our native species actually are threatened with some, fairly worrying pests and diseases, which so that prevents us from planting certain species in certain locations, but also means that there's a risk of planting certain species because they might well be taken over by these pests and diseases. So it's sometimes better to plant either cultivars or other species. So, I mean, obviously we know a lot about ash dieback, which is happening. It's a real problem at the moment. So, for example, we wouldn't be planting many ash trees at the moment in the cities. The oak processionary moth is another big problem, particularly in the southeast of England. So oak trees is another one where you certainly don't want to be planting lots of oak trees all clumped together, maybe sort of individual oaks. But that, they're the ones we hear about. But actually, many of our species are facing sort of quite severe threats, or at least if they're not in the UK at the moment, there is a threat that certain diseases are sort of coming over from the continent, which we need to be very careful of. And that's, fortunately, we've got ever more stringent mechanisms for imports of trees to try to control the risk of that happening. But it's almost impossible to completely prevent it, to be honest with the amount of international trade happening. Things just do get across the seas in some way or another. So, I mean, it is a threat to our native species, and hopefully in time those species will adapt to themselves to live alongside some of these diseases. So that's the longer term I suppose, evolutionary adaptation that happens, but we need to be mindful of planting trees to, to keep those things as factors in our decision making.
In that sense, we have so much in common with trees. When you were just talking there, the last minute, it sounded like you were talking about COVID and, and the diseases spreading across continents and having to adapt and etc.
Yeah, sure.
But so you have confirmed that that tree planting has to be done responsibly. It's not just something, considering the diseases, the different native and non-native species, and it has to be done with a plan and not sort of. It's not just good to plant the tree, like it has to be done well. And it's true that we are kind of submerged by all these different initiatives, everywhere. Again, like I was saying, you buy a t-shirt, you plant a tree, like there's so many different, and there's a lot of question around, like, is this true? Is this real? Is this good? Or is this just greenwashing? Do you have an opinion on how we can make a difference between or how we can identify, tree planting initiatives that are responsible and impactful, like positively on the environment and communities, and those that are just, either not even done or just not done responsibly? Do you have an idea?
I mean, there is, as you say, there's a huge amount going on, and we're seeing lots of businesses getting more and more behind the environment, and their CSR agendas are getting better and better and stronger. And trees are one way that a lot of businesses are getting involved, which is great. We have ourselves a number of corporate partnerships that help us fund the work that we do. They're essential to our work. And we have our own processes for thinking about who we work with and in what way, what we're getting out of it, what they're getting out of it. In a sense, so there's a lot of thought has to go into that. It's difficult, to be honest with you. I mean, I think you need to almost look at every individual organisation on its own merits in terms of those that are perhaps taking the money or planting the trees or doing both. And it's difficult because unless you have all the time in the world to do your due diligence and investigation into organisations, it's difficult to know who you feel do a better job than others. I mean, there's many organisations doing some fantastic work, but there is also a whole host of things going on out there. I think there's a big difference between what's going on in the UK, for example, and internationally in terms of planting, not in the sense that it's a lot cheaper to be planting trees often internationally en masse in terms of huge sort of woodland or forestry restoration planting programs. Just to the sheer scale of those sort of programs means that often the cost per tree, for example, is a lot less than in the UK, where space is different, tree planting is different, and what goes behind it is a sort of different set of activities. Not saying that one is more valid, better or worse than others, but it's a different business completely.
Different model, yeah.
Different one. And I'm sure, I wouldn't be able to say, I wouldn't be able to say which of those programs internationally are better than others, really. You have to really go out there yourself and look at them and understand the impacts that they're having, and ensure there's not any inadvertently causing sort of disbenefits to planting, taking over land, planting on land that would be better not being forest. It's not good to plant trees everywhere. There's some spaces where actually grassland, peat bogs, for example, shouldn't be replaced by forests. They have their own values in terms of carbon, biodiversity, and also for people living in space, you need to be careful that it has to be very respectfully done in terms of where trees are planted. And that's both for the UK and international context. You can't just plant trees wherever you want. You need to work with local communities to understand what works for them, what they need as well. So there are so many factors, and as I say, it's very difficult to know, frankly, which organisations are doing that in the best way and which aren't. I hope most are doing it in the right way and the best.
No, of course. But also,
there is a lot going on. It is for the consumer. It's a bit of a minefield, because you just simply can't answer those questions yourself. So I suppose you have to hope and assume that the companies, if you're purchasing goods, that they're doing their due diligence, they're doing their work with the companies and suppliers or the organisations that they're working with at the sort of delivery end, to ensure that it's happening the right way.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. That makes a lot of sense. I think also another not problem, but the thing that makes it hard is that tree when they're planted, or the trees are very small, and so it takes time to know whether this was successful or not in terms of the trees being healthy and the impact on the environment and society, the local communities.
It does, and the reality is it's a lot of those trees. One thing we need to understand: when you're planting trees at that scale, lots and lots of small saplings, and we call them whips. A lot of them won't make it actually, and that's okay. That's sort of planned into the numbers, just because nature isn't as simple. It's not every when you're planting very young things, some will thrive and grow and others won't. That's just in a way part of the natural course of nature. And actually, as they do grow, they'll start to outcompete each other as well. Actually, you can only have a certain number of 100-year-old huge trees standing in a space together. Actually, if you think about how many small trees you'll plant in a space compared to how many will actually grow up to be the ancient trees of the future, very few of those will get to that stage. And that's part of the natural growth of a woodland. And that needs to be built into the thinking and the calculation. So it's not, I suppose it can be a bit misleading to say plant a tree, put some money towards planting a tree, and we can guarantee that in 100 years' time your tree will be growing happily. What it will hopefully do is it will be part of the natural ecosystem that will create a healthy forest. It might not be that your tree is still there in 100 years, but it will have played a part in that ecosystem to hopefully develop a good piece of forest or woodland for the future. And that these sort of intricacies, I suppose, are difficult to explain. It's more simplistic just to talk about spend X, plant a tree. And that's great. That's definitely a model that's simple for people and people get behind. But there's a lot in reality. There's a lot when you start digging into it that's a bit less or a bit more nuanced than that, perhaps.
Of course, but there was one reality, which is that when you're with Trees for Cities, you have volunteers planting trees. So it's people. Actually, I had volunteered, but it was the weekend of the storm, so it was cancelled. So I still have to volunteer myself with Trees for Cities. But there is this direct impact, which is physically going to plant a tree, and how that makes you connect to nature and makes you feel that power of being able to plant something and hopefully see it grow. But even just that energy and the fact that you're doing this as a local community and you're planting with hope for the future of the world, and I think that's in itself very powerful in terms of the gesture of tree planting. And if it's done well and responsibly, then even better. Of course.
No, sure. No, I mean it's core to what we do. So we always see ourselves as sort of 50% for the trees and 50% for people in a sense. It's or whatever that blend will be. Our work is just as important for the communities that we're planting with and for as it is, in a sense for the sort of more environmental ecosystem benefits that we're creating. And getting people to engage with us, take ownership of their local spaces and to be involved in creating their high quality green space of the future is a very, very powerful thing for the people involved and the communities involved in many ways. And that really is core to what we do. And one of the challenges at the moment, what we're trying to really work through is how you provide opportunities to be involved at a number of points in the process. So planting is great. The trouble with planting is you do it once and it's done. And for lots of people, they want to be involved, and it's beneficial for them to be involved much more than that in different points in that process. So how do people help to influence in the first place how their green spaces are going to look and how they're going to develop? So how do they, what mechanisms do they have in place to play that role within their communities? And then, what role can they play in the actual design of those spaces? So, in terms of how they want them to look, what trees they might want or they don't want, how else that the design of those green spaces could happen. And then obviously there's the planting piece, and then there's the looking after and the maintenance aspect as well. So trees do need to be looked after. Some trees, I mean, not necessarily the little trees so much, but bigger trees need to be watered on the streets. As the small trees grow, it's helpful to keep them in good condition and to get the weeds out from amongst them, for example. So there's quite a lot of activity that can happen after the trees have been planted to ensure that they grow and are as healthy as they possibly can be. So there's lots of different ways that we can really get people involved, and then people can get more involved at a higher level to help promote more greenery, more greening, more tree planting, etc. And that's another space that people can, outside of their local community, can really sort of take a role in. So we're trying to offer as much of that opportunity to people at the moment and explore organisationally how we can make sure people are as engaged in their nature as they possibly can be, and have all of those opportunities available.
Yeah, that definitely makes it a model that is yeah, sustainable, but also very highly impactful in our daily lives and in our connection to nature, because it's very different to just paying for a tree to be planted and actually planting it yourself and taking care of it. And I mean, I strongly believe that this is the way to protect our environments, is by developing that emotional connection and that physical connection to trees. So yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing all this. I do have one last question, which is a question I ask every time. I'm just curious to know whether is there a specific tree in your life that's particularly meaningful to you, or that evokes a memory, whether it's a type of tree or one specific tree?
I think probably for me, yeah, I think I'd say it was there's a willow tree, where I grew up, on the end of a sort of little cul-de-sac just outside in the suburbs. Not the most exciting of locations, if I'm going to be honest, but I lived down, and just outside the house was this little green space, not much bigger than a garden really, with a lovely willow tree in it, with sort of weeping branches. And I do remember spending at the time, those days where I guess the kids at the weekend would just go outside and mess around on the streets and play under the tree, and spending many hours doing that with the other kids down the road. Not quite sure what we did, just sort of messed around outside. But that for me, I think, was thinking back through my childhood, it was, you don't realize it at the time, but it was one of those memories and one of those spaces, and that tree that sort of really represents. And when I go back, actually, my mother still lives on the same street. When I go back, that tree is no longer there, sadly. It aged and it fell down. It just reached the end of its life and has been replaced by a smaller tree that's growing. It's not quite the same, but I really notice it when I go back to that space. I get these sort of visions of the tree that used to exist, and when I realise how important, in a sort of probably more of a sort of subconscious way, that tree was to me. So yeah, I think we all have those connections that perhaps often we don't realise that are there, but can grow with us as we grow up and experience things in the world.
Absolutely. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that story. It's great. Thank you so much, David. Really, I've learned so much. And yeah, I've learned so much about trees for cities as well as in general, like the benefits of tree planting, and of course, like why it's good for us, for our local communities, but also for our environment. And yeah, thanks for sharing honestly your opinions, and it's been great. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Bye.